A waitress receives a mysterious package while working, and when she opens the package, she can't hold back the tears. Ruby woke up early, as usual. The clock showed 5:30 in the morning, and the faint light of dawn barely illuminated the cramped room she shared with her younger sister, Emily. She got up carefully, trying not to wake the girl who was still sleeping soundly. The silence was interrupted only by the soft sound of Emily's breathing, a constant reminder that Ruby had no room for weakness. She had to be strong, for herself and for her sister. The small apartment where they lived was simple and worn by time, but Ruby kept it tidy and clean. Every object had a specific place, and every corner of the house seemed to tell a story of sacrifice and perseverance. In the kitchen, the old coffee maker hissed, releasing the familiar aroma that heralded the start of another long day. Ruby allowed herself a brief moment of contemplation, looking out the window as she took a sip of the hot coffee. Outside, the city was beginning to wake up, indifferent to the silent battle she fought every day. When she arrived at the restaurant, Ruby was greeted by the familiar warmth of the small diner she called her second home. The smell of fresh coffee, bacon, and pancakes mixed with the sound of dishes being arranged and the muffled conversations of the few customers already there. The environment was cozy, with polished wooden tables and checkered tablecloths, reminiscent of a simpler time. "Good morning, Ruby," exclaimed Jane, the cook, with her warm smile that for a moment made Ruby forget the burden she carried on her shoulders. Ruby put on her apron with a quick motion and began to prepare the tables for the morning rush. She greeted the regular customers with a smile that didn't reveal the worries she kept deep in her heart. Mr. Thompson, an elderly man who always had coffee at 7 sharp, was already seated at his usual table by the window. "Beautiful day today, Ruby," he commented, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "I hope the sun brings good news," she replied with a lightness in her voice that didn't match what she felt inside. As she worked, Ruby couldn't stop thinking about her mother. The restaurant was where she had spent the last years of her life, working tirelessly to support her daughters after the premature death of her husband. Ruby remembered the afternoons when she watched her mother serve customers with a kindness that seemed never to run out, even when life was unforgiving. Now, that responsibility fell on her, and no matter how hard she tried, Ruby still felt the absence of maternal guidance and support. The restaurant's activity increased as the morning progressed, and Ruby dedicated herself to work with the same energy and efficiency she had learned from her mother. But behind the swift gestures and professional smile, there was a whirlwind of emotions that Ruby kept well hidden. Every plate served, every cup of coffee delivered was a small victory, proof that she could continue, even when everything seemed to be falling apart around her. The bell above the restaurant door jingled softly, catching Ruby's attention. It was almost lunchtime, and the flow of customers was beginning to slow down, allowing her a brief sigh of relief. She turned to attend to the next customer, but what she saw was a man she didn't recognize. He wore a cap pulled low over his eyes and a simple jacket, making him indistinct, like someone who didn't want to be noticed. He was carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper, holding it carefully as if its contents were of utmost importance. The man approached the counter, his steps firm but silent. Ruby, curious, smiled and asked with her usual kindness, "Can I help with something?" The stranger lifted his head slightly, allowing Ruby to briefly see his eyes. There was something in them, an intensity that made her recoil for a moment. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he extended the package towards her. "This is for you," he said, in a low, somewhat hoarse voice that sounded as if he wasn't used to speaking much. Ruby frowned, surprised. "For me? Are you sure?" she asked, unsure how to react. The man just nodded, without further explanation, and placed the package carefully on the counter. Before Ruby could ask more questions, he was already moving away, almost blending into the shadows of the restaurant, leaving Ruby standing there, looking at the package with a mix of confusion and apprehension. She barely had time to register the situation before hearing the bell jingle again, signaling that the man had left. The presence of the package seemed to alter the atmosphere around her. Ruby felt a strange electricity in the air, as if something very significant had just happened. She watched the box for a few moments, hesitant to touch it. There was no sender, no visible identification, just the brown paper, wrinkled in some parts, and a simple string that held the wrapping together. Her mind began to race, questioning who could have sent it, and more importantly, why. The remaining customers in the restaurant seemed oblivious to the tension Ruby felt. Jane, the cook, glanced in Ruby's direction, noticing the hesitation on the young woman's face, but not asking questions. Everyone was immersed in their own routines, but for Ruby, the world seemed to have stopped around that small box. Her heart beat faster as she tried to understand what that package could mean. Was it just a coincidence? Or was there something deeper behind that unexpected gift? For a few minutes, Ruby fought the urge to open the package right there in the middle of the restaurant. She knew that something in that package would change the course of her day, perhaps even her life. But what? Her mind played with all the possibilities, from something harmless to the most disturbing of secrets. She looked around, trying to focus on work, but the box seemed to call to her, almost as if it had a life of its own, pulsing with a mysterious energy. Finally, Ruby decided that she needed a moment alone to process everything. She picked up the package with trembling hands and told Jane that she needed a quick break. Jane, observing Ruby's fixed and determined gaze, just nodded without asking questions. Ruby left the main dining area and walked to the small storeroom in the back, where she knew she would have a bit of privacy. As she walked away, she felt as though all eyes were on her, though she knew it was just her imagination. Each step seemed heavier, each breath more difficult. She was about to open the package, but something told her that after doing so, nothing would ever be the same. In the small storeroom, Ruby felt her heart hammering in her chest, as if each beat echoed in the silence around her. The yellowish light from the lamp above cast soft shadows on the walls, creating an almost intimate atmosphere. She placed the package on the wooden table, the rough surface contrasting with the softness of the brown paper. For a moment, she hesitated, her fingers hovering over the string that kept the package closed. The fear of the unknown battled with the growing curiosity inside her. Who could have sent this? And more importantly, why? Taking a deep breath, Ruby began to untie the string, the knots slowly unraveling, as if the package itself resisted being opened. Every movement seemed to slow down time, and she found herself holding her breath as she pulled the last loop of the string. As she carefully removed the paper, a strange sensation ran through her body, a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. There was something solemn about that moment, as if she was about to unearth a truth long buried. When the paper finally came off, it revealed a simple wooden box, old and slightly worn. Ruby ran her fingers over the surface, feeling the grooves and imperfections that told stories of another time. She wondered how many hands had held that box before her, and if anyone else had felt the same mix of fear and hope that she felt now. With one last deep breath, Ruby opened the lid, hoping that the contents would bring answers, but fearing the truths that might come to light. Inside the box, the first item she saw was a small yellowed envelope, sealed with red wax. Ruby held it for a moment, sensing the symbolic weight it carried. She decided to set it aside for now, as something else caught her attention. A larger, more significant object. Beneath the envelope lay a leather-bound album, its edges worn with time. It was clearly old, and the mere touch of the rough leather made Ruby feel a strange connection to that object, as if the album had been waiting for her for years. Ruby opened the album with trembling hands, each page revealing images that seemed distant yet disturbingly familiar. Her heart raced even more when she saw the first photo, a small child with a radiant smile playing in a garden. She frowned, trying to recall that face, that scene. It was like a déjà vu, a forgotten memory that was now returning in an overwhelming way. Each page turned brought new questions, new pieces of a puzzle that Ruby didn't know existed. The anxiety increased with each new image and with the words she had yet to read. The silence around her seemed almost deafening, as if the world outside had disappeared, leaving her alone with her discoveries. Ruby felt the weight of the impending revelations, and for a moment, she wished she hadn't opened the package. But now it was too late to turn back. There was a path to follow, and the answers were there, within her reach, even if she wasn't prepared for what would come next. Finally, Ruby turned her attention to the sealed envelope. Her trembling fingers carefully broke the seal, and she pulled out a handwritten letter, the words delicately drawn in a script that seemed to come straight from another era. As she began to read, her heart beat irregularly, as if it already knew that by the end of that letter, her life would never be the same. Fear and hope mixed, creating a whirlwind of emotions that Ruby could barely contain, but that pushed her inexorably toward the truth she was about to discover. Ruby's hands trembled slightly as she ran her fingertips over the pages of the album. Each image that appeared before her eyes seemed to steal a piece of her breath. There, captured in sepia tones, were moments from a past she couldn't recall, but that somehow belonged to her. With each new photograph, Ruby felt as if she were unearthing a lost part of her history, a part that had been kept secret, hidden in the shadows for reasons she still didn't understand. The first pages showed a young, smiling woman whom Ruby immediately recognized as her mother, but there was something different about her. In those images, her mother seemed lighter, happier, without the weight that Ruby had always seen in her eyes as she grew up. It was as if the photos showed a version of her mother that Ruby had never known, a version free of worries and sorrows. But what intrigued her most were the other people beside her, figures Ruby had never seen but who seemed so close, so intimately connected to her mother's life. As she turned another page, Ruby found a series of photos that made her heart race. They were images of a place that seemed familiar, a large house with a lush garden where a small girl ran and played. Ruby observed the girl closely, and a shiver ran down her spine. It was her. She recognized herself in those old photos, but the setting was strange, as if it belonged to a life she had never consciously lived. And then, there were the adults around her, a couple who smiled at the camera, but whose identities remained a mystery. The letters, carefully folded and placed between the pages, caught her attention. Ruby picked up the first one, feeling the thin paper between her fingers, and began to read. The handwriting was fluid and elegant, but the words that danced before her eyes were heavy, laden with secrets. The letter spoke of difficult decisions, of choices made in moments of desperation. Every sentence felt like a stab in the chest, revealing parts of her family's story that Ruby could never have imagined. These were words that carried the weight of regret and pain, written by someone who was trying to justify the unjustifiable. One of the letters revealed something that made Ruby's blood run cold. It was a confession, a truth buried for years, involving not only her mother, but also a man, mentioned with a mix of reverence and sadness. The words described an intense relationship, marked by passion and secrets that needed to be kept at all costs. But the most shocking revelation came at the end of the letter, where a simple but devastating sentence changed everything Ruby thought she knew about her own origins. The man described there, this unknown figure, had a crucial role in Ruby's life, a role she had never imagined. Feeling on the verge of a breakdown, Ruby hurriedly flipped through the rest of the album, searching for more clues, more answers. And they came, one after the other, each image and each letter forming a dark mosaic of her family's past. She saw photos of places she couldn't place, faces that seemed familiar but whose identities eluded her memory. The letters spoke of buried secrets, of a life her mother had before Ruby was born, a life filled with dangers and impossible choices. There were mentions of distant places, of people who had been left behind, all in the name of protecting what was most precious. Ruby turned another page of the album, and her heart stopped for a second when her eyes fixed on a new series of photos. At the center of each one was a tall man with strong features and a slightly shy, almost melancholic smile. She didn't recognize him immediately, but there was something deeply familiar in those eyes, something that made her feel a tight knot in her chest. It was as if somehow she already knew who he was, even without having clear memories of him. The photos showed the man at different moments, always in places that Ruby vaguely recognized but couldn't place in time. He was beside her mother in several images, in some, holding her with a tenderness that Ruby had never seen in any other photo of her mother. It was evident that they shared something special, something that had been kept under lock and key. There was one photo in particular that made her stop and analyze every detail. It was an image of the two of them, her mother and that man, sitting in a park, laughing at something the photographer hadn't captured. The look in his eyes was intense, filled with an emotion that seemed almost palpable. And then, like a bolt of lightning, the truth hit Ruby. She looked at the man once more, this time with more attention, noticing the small similarities between him and herself. The shape of the face, the slight arch of the eyebrows, even the pensive expression he had in one of the photos. All of it was frighteningly familiar. Ruby felt a wave of shock and disbelief spread through her body. This man, who until that moment was a complete stranger, was none other than her father, the mysterious figure who had always been absent from her life. Ruby ran her fingers over the image as if trying to connect with the man she had never known. Her heart raced, a mix of sadness, anger, and confusion taking over her mind. She had always believed that her father had disappeared before she had any memory of him, and her mother had never spoken much about him. There had always been a silence, a painful void where the father figure should have been. And now, before her eyes, was the proof that he had existed, that he had been an important part of her mother's life, and, by extension, of hers as well. The emotions began to overflow, and Ruby realized that silent tears were streaming down her face. The idea that her father had been so close, yet so distant, left her stunned. She imagined how different her life might have been if he had been present, if he hadn't disappeared. Did he choose to leave them? Did he know of her existence? Or perhaps there was something much darker that she still didn't know. The questions began to arise, one after the other, creating a whirlwind of thoughts that Ruby could barely organize. Ruby returned to the album, searching for more clues about the identity and role of this man in her life. There were more photos of him, some alone, others beside her mother, and in one, holding a baby that Ruby knew was herself. The image took her breath away. He looked so happy, so complete, as if that moment was all he needed. The sight of that moment frozen in time only deepened the mystery of what had happened. Why then did he disappear? Why did he never return? The answers were still out of reach, but now, she was determined to find them. With a new sense of urgency, Ruby picked up the letters again. Each one seemed to carry more weight now, as if they contained not just words, but also the answers to all the enigmas that surrounded her. With a heavy heart, Ruby held the first letter, feeling the weight of the words she was about to read. The handwriting was firm, but it carried a certain hesitation, as if each letter had been drawn with care, reflecting the gravity of what was being revealed. As she began to read, the first lines already made it clear that this was no ordinary letter. It was a confession, an attempt to explain the inexplicable, to justify an absence that had marked her life so deeply. Dear Ruby, if you are reading this, it means you already know something I never had the courage to tell you. Thus began the first letter, and those initial words already brought a sense of irreparable loss. The author, her father, spoke with evident pain, describing the moment when he decided to distance himself from the family. He didn't do it of his own free will, but out of overwhelming fear, a danger that loomed over them, forcing him to make a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. Each sentence was like a stab. He described how, by getting involved with dangerous people, he became a threat to those he loved most. Ruby, still very young at the time, couldn't understand, but he couldn't live with the idea that his presence could put her and her mother's lives at risk. The only possible choice was to disappear, to hide in the shadows, hoping that by doing so, he would protect them from a tragic fate. But the weight of that decision consumed him, and he spent sleepless nights tormented by the pain of not being by their side. Her father's regret overflowed in every line. He spoke of the moments he missed, Ruby's first words, the birthdays spent without him. In his self-imposed loneliness, he sought information about them from afar, trying to convince himself that he had done the right thing, even if it meant living in a constant state of suffering. The pain of not being able to hug her, of not being the father she deserved, was evident in every word. He admitted that the decision to leave them was the biggest mistake of his life, a mistake he desperately tried to make amends for. The following letters revealed a life of silent regret and a quest for redemption that never materialized. He described the years he spent trying to rebuild his life, always with Ruby in his thoughts, trying to find a way to return, to be present. But fear, always fear, kept him at a distance. The people he had fled from were still out there, still a threat, and he couldn't risk Ruby or her mother being harmed because of his past mistakes. The distance, though painful, was his way of keeping them safe. Ruby felt a mix of anger and sadness. On the one hand, she understood the dilemma her father had faced, the terror of losing everything because of bad decisions. But on the other hand, she couldn't ignore the void he had left in her life, a void that no explanation, no matter how sincere, could fully fill. Her father was there, in spirit, in all the letters, but at the same time, he was never truly present, never shared the moments when she needed him most. As she read the last letter, Ruby realized that despite everything, her father still loved her deeply. He spoke of his hope that one day she might understand his reasons, that she might forgive him, even if he never had the chance to explain himself in person. "I know I cannot ask for your forgiveness, Ruby," one of the last lines read, "but I want you to know that I never stopped thinking about you, and that, even from afar, I have always been your father." The tears Ruby had been holding back finally fell, streaming silently down her cheeks as she absorbed the final words of a man who had been a shadow in her life, but who now, through these letters, became more real than ever. When Ruby opened the last letter, she noticed something different about it. The envelope was more worn, as if it had been handled many times before finally being sealed and sent. Her father's handwriting, already familiar by now, seemed shakier, as if he had struggled to write each word. With her heart racing, Ruby slid the letter out, feeling that something crucial was about to be revealed. The air in the storeroom seemed denser, and she knew that this letter could change everything. "My dear Ruby," the letter began, "if you have made it this far, it is because you already know the truth about me and what separated us. But there is still something you need to know, something I could not say before. I believe now is the right time." Ruby held her breath, her eyes scanning the lines with a mixture of anxiety and fear. Her father spoke of an important person she needed to meet, someone who could answer the questions he, out of fear or guilt, never had the courage to answer. As she continued reading, Ruby felt a chill run down her spine. "There is a person, Ruby, who has always been waiting for you, someone who has patiently awaited the chance to reunite with you. This person has kept secrets that I could not bear alone, secrets that now belong to you. If you are ready to face the past and discover the whole truth, go to the address I am leaving here. Do not be afraid, my daughter. This person loves you as much as I have loved you, and perhaps even more." Ruby swallowed hard, feeling the letter tremble in her hands. Her eyes finally found the bottom of the page, where a small piece of paper was taped. It was an address, written in small, careful letters. She read it several times, trying to memorize every detail. There was something final and irrevocable in that gesture, as if this meeting was the last chapter of a story that had been written long before she was born. Ruby's head was spinning with possibilities. Who could this person be? An unknown relative? A friend of her father? Or perhaps someone connected to her mother's mysterious past? The idea of meeting this person filled her with equal parts hope and fear. The address seemed so concrete, so real, as if the truth was finally within her reach, waiting for her somewhere beyond what she knew. But the courage to follow this path, to face what she might find, was something Ruby wasn't sure she possessed. Ruby reread the letter several times, each word embedding itself in her soul. The final lines from her father sounded like a plea, almost a supplication. "Go, Ruby. I know I have already asked much of you, but this is my last request. Go meet this person and discover what time and fear have stolen from us. I hope one day you can understand, and perhaps forgive me." The tears that had been silently streaming down her eyes began to fall more heavily as Ruby sat down, letting the magnitude of everything envelop her. The silence in the storeroom was absolute, but within Ruby, there was a storm of emotions. Her father's words, the address, the request for a meeting, everything was tangled in her mind, forming a knot she knew she would need to untangle. The letter trembled slightly in her hands, as if the responsibility it carried was too much to bear. But despite all the pain, there was something comforting in the idea that this meeting could finally bring the answers she had been searching for so long. The sun was low on the horizon when Ruby closed the door of the small apartment behind her, feeling the weight of the decision she had just made. Her father's letter, with the address that promised answers, was carefully folded in the pocket of her jacket, pressed against her chest like a talisman. Each step she took on the cold sidewalk seemed to echo the turmoil of emotions she felt inside. Fear, hope, anger, curiosity, all mixed together, forming a knot in her throat that she couldn't undo. Ruby had thought about everything the night before, weighing the pros and cons, but deep down she knew she had no choice. She needed to understand what had happened, needed to meet this person her father had mentioned. His words, filled with regret and a distant love, pushed her forward, despite the fear of what she might find. The address was for a neighboring town, a place Ruby knew only in passing, but which now seemed to carry new meaning, an inescapable destination. She took the early morning bus, the city still shrouded in a soft mist that made everything seem like a dream. Ruby chose a seat near the window, watching the familiar streets disappear as the vehicle moved away from everything she knew. Each mile traveled seemed to distance her more from her present and push her into the past, into the secrets waiting to be unearthed. Her heart beat unevenly, not just from fear, but from the hope of finally obtaining the answers she had longed for. As the bus traveled along the winding road, Ruby looked out the window, lost in thought. She wondered who would be waiting for her at the end of this journey. Would it be someone who had known her since childhood, or a complete stranger with stories that would turn her world upside down? Each minute seemed to stretch into hours as the bus moved along the road. Ruby passed the time recalling the photos and letters, trying to piece together the puzzle that was her past. The images of her father, now so real and present, wouldn't leave her mind. What would he be like in person, if he were still alive? What would he say when he saw her, a grown woman now, bearing the pain and scars of his absence? Ruby knew she needed to be prepared for anything, but uncertainty was a cruel companion. When the bus finally stopped at the small station in the neighboring town, Ruby felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves as she stepped down the steps and touched the cold ground of the new town. The air seemed different there, denser, as if the very environment was steeped in the memories and secrets she was about to uncover. The address was only a few blocks away, and with a mix of determination and fear, Ruby began to walk, her steps echoing down the quiet street. With each corner she turned, the anticipation grew. Ruby knew she was approaching something big, something that could redefine her entire history. The houses along the way seemed to watch her pass, each one holding its own stories, but none as crucial as the one Ruby was about to unveil. The sun was already low in the sky when Ruby finally stopped in front of the house indicated in the address. It was a simple structure, painted a light blue that had faded over time. The small windows were covered with lace curtains, and the garden, though well kept, had an air of abandonment, as if no one had cared to plant new flowers for a long time. Ruby felt a tightness in her chest as she looked at that house. It was modest, but it carried an invisible weight, a story that seemed to hide behind every brick. She hesitated for a moment before climbing the steps that led to the front door. Each step seemed to echo in the stillness of the street, and Ruby had the feeling that time had slowed down, making every movement more intense, more significant. She raised her hand, ready to knock on the door, but her legs wavered for a moment. She took a deep breath, gathering courage, and finally knocked, the sound reverberating through the interior of the house. The wait that followed was short, but it felt like an eternity. The door opened slowly, revealing an elderly woman, frail in appearance, who looked at Ruby with eyes that seemed full of memories. She was thin, almost ethereal, and her white hair, pulled back in a bun, contrasted with her pale, wrinkled skin. But there was something in the woman's eyes that held Ruby's attention, a mix of surprise, pain, and a gentle tenderness that she hadn't expected to find. "You must be Ruby," the woman said in a soft voice, but one laden with emotion, as if those words were both a confirmation and a relief. Ruby felt a lump form in her throat as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The woman opened the door fully and gestured for Ruby to enter. The inside of the house was as simple as the outside, with old furniture and framed photos on the walls showing people Ruby didn't recognize. But there was warmth there, a silent welcome that made her feel, in a way, at home. "Please, sit down," the woman said, pointing to a nearby armchair. Ruby obeyed, feeling that her knees might give way at any moment. "I've been waiting for this day for a long time," the woman continued, sitting in a chair across from Ruby. Her gaze was intense, as if she were examining every detail of Ruby's face, searching for traces of the past. "I am your Aunt Clara," she said, finally introducing herself. Ruby blinked, surprised by the revelation. She had never known she had a maternal aunt. Her mother had never mentioned Clara or any other close relatives. And now, here she was, facing a woman who seemed to know much more about her story than Ruby could have ever imagined. Clara seemed to read Ruby's thoughts, for she quickly continued, "There are many things you don't know, my dear. Things that were kept secret to protect you but now need to be revealed." There was a deep sadness in Clara's voice, a burden she seemed to have carried alone for many years. Ruby felt a chill run down her spine. She was about to hear truths that could change everything she thought she knew about her family. But there was also a certain comfort in Clara's presence, a feeling that finally she was not alone in this search for answers. Clara took a deep breath before beginning to speak, as if she were about to open a door she had kept closed for a long time. "Your father, he never wanted to leave you, Ruby," she said, looking directly into her niece's eyes. "But there were forces at play, dangers you can't imagine. He was a good man, but he got involved with dangerous people who wouldn't hesitate to harm those he loved most." Ruby felt a shiver down her spine. Clara's words were like pieces of a puzzle finally beginning to fit together. "These people," Clara continued, "were ruthless. By the time he realized how deeply he was involved, it was too late. Your father made the only decision he could at that moment, to distance himself, to cut all ties, in the hope of keeping you and your mother safe. He disappeared to protect you, Ruby." Each of Clara's words seemed heavier than the last. Ruby imagined the anguish her father must have felt in making that decision, the pain of distancing himself from his family to save them. "He tried everything to find a way out," Clara said, her voice laden with sorrow. "But the enemies he made were powerful. Any wrong move could have put you both in mortal danger. So, he hid, watching from afar, making sure nothing bad happened to you." Ruby's eyes began to fill with tears as she imagined her father, living in the shadows, watching her grow up from a distance, unable to be present. "But why didn't he come back when things calmed down?" Ruby asked, her voice almost a whisper. Clara hesitated for a moment, as if she didn't want to continue but knew she had to. "Things never really calmed down," Clara replied. "Even with the passage of years, the threat never completely disappeared. He always feared that if he got close again, those men would find him and use you to get to him." Ruby felt a mixture of anger and sadness. Anger at everything that had been taken from her, but also sadness for her father, who bore the burden of protecting them alone. "He told me once," Clara said, her eyes filled with memories, "that the hardest thing he ever did was watch from afar, unable to be by your side. But he never stopped loving you, Ruby. Every step he took, every decision, was for you." The silence that followed was heavy, full of unspoken emotions. Ruby realized there was a depth to her father's story that she could never have imagined. He wasn't just the man who had disappeared. He was someone who sacrificed his own happiness to ensure his daughter's safety. "He wanted to come back," Clara continued, "but he knew it would put everyone at risk. He carried that burden until the end, always wondering if he had made the right choice." Ruby felt the tears streaming down her face, not bothering to wipe them away. There was a deep pain in discovering all of this so late, but also a strange comfort in knowing that, despite everything, her father had never truly abandoned her. He was there, in the shadows, protecting her, even if she had never realized it. And now, finally, Ruby was beginning to understand the complexity of the love and sacrifice that shaped her family's story. Ruby was trembling as Clara led her down a narrow, dimly lit hallway. The walls, covered with old photographs and dusty paintings, seemed to whisper secrets of times past. The tension in the air was palpable, and every step Ruby took brought her closer to a moment she had imagined countless times, but never like this. At the end of the hallway, Clara stopped in front of a partially open door and turned to Ruby, her eyes softly tearful. "He's inside, Ruby. He's waiting for you." With her heart pounding, Ruby carefully pushed the door open, revealing a small, simple room where the air was dense and heavy. The soft afternoon light filtered through the window, illuminating the bed where a man lay. He was lying down, covered by a thin blanket, his irregular breathing echoing through the room. When Ruby entered, he opened his eyes slowly, and for a moment, father and daughter stared at each other as if time had stopped. She recognized those eyes immediately, the same eyes that had watched her in the old photos, full of a mixture of love and regret. "Ruby." His voice came out weak but full of emotion, as if that single word carried all the weight of years of absence. Ruby felt her legs give way, and she approached slowly, unable to take her eyes off him. Silent tears streamed down her face as she knelt beside the bed, gently holding his hand. His skin was cold and pale, a stark contrast to the firm and strong hands she had imagined. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice broken by weakness. Ruby shook her head, unable to speak at the moment. Clara's words still echoed in her mind, and now, face to face with her father, she understood the depth of the sacrifice he had made. "I never wanted to leave you. Never wanted to," he began to say, but the coughing interrupted his words, the harsh sound reverberating through the room. Ruby squeezed his hand, trying to convey the comfort he so desperately needed. "I know, Dad," she finally managed to murmur, her voice trembling. "I know you did what you thought was right." He looked at her with an expression of relief mixed with pain, as if those words were a balm for years of accumulated guilt. "I watched you grow up from afar, every step, every smile. I was there, even if you couldn't see me," he said, his eyes filling with tears. Ruby felt a tightness in her chest, emotions overflowing as she tried to process what he was saying. All that time he had been in the shadows, watching over her as she grew up without knowing the truth. "I never stopped loving you, Ruby," he continued, his voice faltering at times. "You were always the reason for everything I did. Regret is a pain I carry every day, but seeing you here now, knowing you're okay, is more than I could have asked for." Ruby held back her sobs as she saw the sincerity in her father's eyes, feeling that, despite everything, they still had a bond that time and distance could not break. The silence that followed was filled with unspoken feelings, words that neither knew how to express. But at that moment, they weren't necessary. The reunion, so painfully awaited, brought with it a strange peace, a sense that despite all the mistakes and separations, they were still father and daughter, connected by something that went beyond words and absences. Ruby knew their time together might be short, but she was determined to make the most of every second. To get to know the man who, even from afar, had always loved her in a way she was only now beginning to understand. Ruby was still holding her father's hand when he looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. There was something he needed to say, something that seemed to weigh as heavily as the secrets already revealed. He took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to confess one last truth. "Ruby, there is something you need to know. Something I was never able to tell you before," he began, his voice soft but firm. Ruby felt a chill, sensing that she was about to discover something monumental. "All these years," he continued, "I wasn't just running away. I was building something that was always meant for you, even if you didn't know it." Ruby frowned, confused. Her father paused for a moment, struggling against the weakness that overtook him before continuing. I created a company, one that became much bigger than I could have imagined. But everything I did, every decision, was made with your future in mind. I knew that one day you would need something to protect you, to guarantee you a safe and stable life, far from the dangers I faced. Ruby could barely believe what she was hearing. A company? Her father, the man she had known only through shadows and secrets, had built an empire while remaining hidden? This company, Ruby, he said, looking directly into her eyes, is now yours. I want you to take it over, to lead it with the same strength and determination I've always seen in you, even from a distance. His words sounded surreal, as if she had entered an alternate reality where nothing made sense, but everything was strangely coherent. She remained silent, trying to process what he had just said. The idea of owning a multi-million-dollar company was completely foreign to her reality as a waitress in a small restaurant. But why me? She finally asked, her voice almost inaudible. He squeezed her hand with the little strength he had left. Because you were always the purpose of all this. I did this for you, Ruby. And now, I don't have much time left. I need you to be strong, to accept this legacy and turn it into something good, something that goes beyond everything I managed to achieve. Ruby felt an overwhelming mix of emotions. The initial shock was being replaced by a deep sense of responsibility. Her father, the distant man who had sacrificed so much, was now placing in her hands the fruit of years of work and sacrifice. I don't know if I can, she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. He looked at her with tenderness, a weak smile forming on his lips. You can, Ruby. You always could. You have your mother's strength, the courage I've seen grow in you. This company is not just a way to redeem my mistakes, but a way to ensure that you never have to go through the difficulties you faced again. Silence fell over the room once again, dense and full of meaning. Ruby knew that this revelation was not just a gift, but also a burden. She looked at her father, searching for some guidance, some assurance that she was ready to take on something so big. He simply watched her, his eyes tired, but filled with a confidence she did not expect. Do what your heart tells you, he finally said. But know that I believe in you, Ruby. I always have. And with those words, he left her alone with the enormity of the legacy that was now in her hands. Ruby sat in a chair in the corner of the room, staring at the floor as her father's words echoed in her mind. The revelation that she was now responsible for a multi-million-dollar company was almost unbelievable, a reality that did not fit with the life she had always known. The small-town waitress who struggled to pay bills and take care of her younger sister suddenly found herself at the head of an empire she had never known existed. The weight of this responsibility overwhelmed her, making her question whether she was ready for what lay ahead. She thought of her mother, of all the sacrifices they had both made to survive after he left. Now, Ruby had the chance to change everything, to ensure they would never again struggle for financial security. But along with this opportunity came countless doubts. How could she, with no experience, lead a company of such magnitude? The fear of failure enveloped her like a shadow, and Ruby wondered if her father had placed too much faith in her abilities. Her father's words resonated in her mind. You can, Ruby. You always could. But Ruby couldn't help but think about the consequences of accepting this legacy. There were people who depended on this company, lives that would be impacted by her decisions. And what if she failed? Ruby knew that the decision she made now would not only affect her, but everyone around her as well. She thought of Emily, her younger sister, who had always seen her as a figure of strength and stability. How could she disappoint her? And more than that, how could she disappoint her father, who saw her as his successor, the person capable of carrying on what he could not? As she reflected, Ruby felt the magnitude of the choice before her. She could refuse, return to her previous simpler life, but one that was also full of limitations. Or she could accept the challenge, with all its risks and uncertainties, and launch herself into a future she could never have imagined for herself. The legacy her father had left her was not just a company. It was an opportunity to redefine her life, to build something that honored her family, and the sacrifices they had made. Finally, Ruby stood up, the weight of the decision still present, but now accompanied by a new clarity. She didn't know exactly how she would do it, but one thing was certain. She would not let fear define her actions. The responsibility her father had entrusted to her was immense, but it was also a chance to turn all the difficulties they had faced into something grand. Ruby looked at her father, who watched her in silence and knew that regardless of the challenges that lay ahead, she was ready to face the consequences of her choice. Ruby's life was about to change radically, and she felt the impact of this decision reverberating through every fiber of her being. But now, there was a firm determination in her heart. The first days at the company were a whirlwind for Ruby. The boardroom, with its glass walls and polished wood tables, was a completely different world from the one she knew. Right at the entrance, the employees looked at her with curiosity, some with skepticism, others with discreet hope in their eyes. Ruby felt the weight of their expectations, but also the responsibility of honoring her father's legacy. Every decision felt like a mountain, every choice a minefield. But beside her, though frail, was her father, guiding her through the first steps, offering advice that carried years of experience. In her first meeting with the directors, Ruby was nervous, but she held her head high. The faces before her were of people accustomed to power, to control, and now they were facing a young woman who, until recently, was just a waitress. The tension in the room was palpable, but Ruby felt her father's hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of support. She began to speak, her voice trembling at first, but gaining strength as she explained her intentions for the company's future. "I am here to learn," she said, looking into the eyes of each person present. "But I am also here to ensure that my father's sacrifice was not in vain." The weeks that followed were an emotional roller coaster. Ruby spent her days at the company, learning the complex details of the business, and her nights beside her father, absorbing every piece of wisdom he could share. He taught her not only about the world of business but about life, about the value of people, about how to lead with compassion and firmness. And Ruby, despite all the challenges, began to find her rhythm, discovering an inner strength she never knew she had. However, her father's health was rapidly deteriorating. Each day that passed, he seemed more fragile, but the determination in his eyes never wavered. "Ruby," he said one sunny afternoon as they sat in the garden, "the company is important, yes, but what really matters are the people. Never forget that. Money, power, all of that is fleeting. But the relationships you build, the impact you have on people's lives, that is what truly leaves a mark." Ruby held his hand, feeling the gravity of his words, knowing that he was preparing to say goodbye. Amid these intense days, Ruby began making changes in the company. Small at first, but significant. She introduced policies that reflected the values her father had taught her: respect, integrity, and care for the employees. Some directors resisted, doubting her leadership ability, but Ruby did not back down. She proved herself to be a leader who, although new to the position, had a clear vision of what she wanted to achieve. And slowly, she began to earn the respect of everyone, not because of her name, but because of her actions. The time Ruby spent with her father in his final days was precious. Each conversation, each smile, a silent farewell. They talked about the past, but also about the future. A future that Ruby now saw full of possibilities, even in the face of the imminent loss. "I wish I could be by your side longer," he said, his voice weak but firm. "But I know you are ready. You always have been, even if you didn't know it. I am proud of you, Ruby." On the night her father passed away, Ruby stayed by his side, holding his hand until his last breath. The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. She felt an unexpected peace, knowing that he had passed away in peace, knowing that he trusted her to continue what he had started. The grief was deep, but Ruby knew her father didn't want her to be trapped in sorrow. He wanted her to live, to flourish, to carry forward everything he had taught her. The days that followed were difficult, but Ruby got up every morning with a new determination. She was ready to face the challenges ahead, to lead the company her father had built. But more than that, to live the life he wanted for her. The future was still uncertain, full of challenges, but Ruby was prepared for each one. With her father's memory in her heart and the lessons he left behind, she knew that no matter what the future brought, she was ready to face it with her head held high. If you enjoyed Ruby's incredible story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you love emotional chronicles and want to support our channel to continue bringing more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your help is essential for us to keep improving. Thank you for your support. Until the next emotional chronicle.